Okay, hey everybody. So this is the much-awaited review video for the C# final. I spent a long time today trying to answer all the questions, so I apologize that it's so late getting posted. But the final closes tomorrow at 4 p.m., so hopefully you have plenty of time to look at the video and then kind of review your notes and all that before taking it. If you scroll to the very bottom of the course, final exam, here it is. It's out of 90 points. You have now 2 hours to take the test. It's 30 questions, 3 points apiece. And I want to make sure that everybody that has SDRC accommodations gets the accommodations. I forgot to kind of notify you guys. I know that it's not required that I do that, but I want to be transparent. So if you have an ADA accommodation, everyone is getting an ADA accommodation for the test. So it should be a 60-minute exam. You have 120 minutes to do it. So you should not have a problem with time. And it's also open notes. So you can look at this video, you can look at the PowerPoint slides, whatever you want. And I want to reiterate that it's entirely reasonable that you could get 100 on the final, and you could get a decent grade in the class and still not learn a dang thing. And that's fine if that's the way that you want to live your life. But I think that you're paying for a little bit more than that. So I hope that you take the final seriously, that you review the material, that you at least give it a shot, and you learn something from it. That's what the entire semester has been about. So if we go back, starting with the kind of easy stuff to review for the exam. So there is a possibility that up to 33% of the exam will be taken directly from the Unit 1 quiz. If you are the luckiest student who draws really well on the random number generator, that will be you. I would go through Unit 1 quiz. I would make sure that I remember what an abstract class is. I would make sure that I remember what a virtual method is. I would remember the difference between an abstract and a virtual method. I would remember the difference between a C# virtual method and a Java virtual method. I would remember the difference between properties and backing fields, for example. So all of this sort of kind of rudimentary object-oriented stuff that we went over prior to doing the homework tracker, that stuff could be in up to 10 questions on the exam. That's not to say that you will have 10 questions. 10 questions is the maximum that you'll see from this. This should be open, so you should be able to go in here and look at your previous answers. You should be able to look at the correct answers for those questions. You should look at them. You should make sure that you're comfortable with the grade that you got and why you got the grade that you got. These should be the easiest points on the final that you could possibly get. And if you go back through this PowerPoint presentation, for example, gives a lot of the information that I just talked about. So what is the difference between a virtual and an abstract, for example? All of that information should be in this PowerPoint presentation right here. Okay. So outside of that, the bulk of the final comes from Module 3 and Module 4 and Module 5, Module 6, and Module 7. So starting with Module number 3. You should definitely remember the difference between a model and a view model. If you are not super comfortable with WPF as a general concept, and you prefer to not do the WPF application because you have a Mac or because of any other reason, you can also review this video right here, and you can also review this PowerPoint, which will walk you through all of that same content without the application. So it talks about the stopwatch presentation or the stopwatch app that we built, but it doesn't necessarily require you to step through the code. All of the theory that you will see on the final around MVVM and MVC, around why we might use a view model versus a model for a specific reason, will also be right here in these things. So a lot of the other information on the final or kind of test questions will come from video 4 and this related PowerPoint, and from these kind of discussions before the fact. So the final is heavily reliant on your ability to articulate why we might want to develop a distributed, sort of multi-layered application. It is very focused on you understanding the different layers, the order of the layers, and the way that you communicate between them. So if we go into this PowerPoint, I'll kind of make that kind of concrete. So if we go all the way to the bottom here, and I'm going to zoom this out. Okay, so if we think about the SPA app or the console app or the WPF app that you created for assignment number 4 and subsequently assignment number 5. The workstation part of that in the SPA case is the HTML and the JavaScript running on the client through the browser. If you wrote a WPF application, you have a whole separate Visual Studio project that has a WPF app in it. If you wrote a console application, you have a whole different project that has a console application in it. And all of that code runs client side. It's in either like a browser sort of context or as a standalone application that can communicate with the server, but it has completely different code. So this is your console app. This is your SPA, this is your WPF app. Then you have server-side logic. So in this class, what we've done is we've combined the web server and the database server into one server. So this stuff is actually running on the same machine. This illustration basically is saying that it doesn't have to be, right? You can have a database server wherever you want it to be. And that database server could be in a drastically different place than your web server. For example, if this is on Azure, your database server might be in Singapore and your web server might be on the West Coast somewhere. And that's entirely fine. It's entirely up to you and Microsoft to figure out where to put it. But these don't necessarily have to be in the same place. In the class for assignment number 4 and assignment number 5, they were. All of this stuff was on the same machine. And in fact, it was on the same machine as the workstation stuff. But remember, all of these things can be split onto multiple machines. So what is the order of operations? So the order of operations is a client runs up your application on the client side. So they go to your website, they launch the WPF app, or they launch the console application, and they interact with it. So they send a request to add a new student or to add a new class or to check the balance of their bank account. And the way that they do that is by issuing an HTTP request from the client to the server. So we talked kind of at length about 2 specific types of HTTP requests. You have HTTP GET requests, that is G-E-T, GET requests. Those things do not have a body associated with them. They can only transmit data through the route. And you also have POST requests that do have a body, and you can send sensitive information in the body of that POST request through something like HTTPS by encrypting the body over TLS connection. So it's point-to-point encryption. So you immediately have a sort of branch here. So in the workstation code or on the client side, you have the opportunity to make a GET or a POST request. The web server has to have, in our case, a web API controller that is listening for either a GET or a POST request at the prescribed route. And if they don't match, so if you make a GET request to add or update movies, for example, and over here it is a POST request, the request will fail and you will not be able to communicate with the server. If they match both the route and the type of request, then what will happen is you establish a connection with the server. So from the client to the server, we've made an HTTP request. So that could come in the flavor of an HTTP client request that you've made from a console application using the HTTP request handler or web request handler class that's in the console application sample, or through the $HTTP service that we looked at in Angular. In either case, what's happening is you're taking a request, you're taking some data, you're bundling that data with the request. In the event of a GET request, that goes in the route. In the event of a POST request, it could go in the route or in the body. Typically goes in the body. So that request originates on the client, it goes to the server, and in our setup, and for the majority of this class, that request is serviced by a web API controller. So the first layer of the server-side code is the web API controller, which services all communication between the client and the server-side code. So web API controller in an ideal scenario should be responsible only for communication. It expresses all of the classes and the method routes and the types of requests those methods can actually service. And then what it does is it automatically, through route binding or the use of the from body attribute, takes the request and then translates the request into strongly typed C# parameters, and then passes those parameters into the method. And that method then passes the actual business logic off to what's called the EC, or the enterprise controller. So the enterprise controller also sits on the web server, but it is basically the second layer. So if you imagine splitting this thing in half, on the left-hand side facing the client, you have the web API controller. On the right-hand side facing the database, you have the EC. So this EC class only appears in the server-side code. You should never have an EC on the client side unless you have an SPA that the entire thing is one project. So the web API controller passes the information from the client to the EC. The EC then does whatever business logic you want, if it's ID synchronization, if it's whatever you need to do, and then it passes all of that information over to the database server or whatever persistence you want to use. So in this class, we talked about SQL client interacting with Microsoft SQL as a database or persistent strategy. We also talked about entity framework, which is an ORM or object relational mapping as a way to interact with Microsoft SQL Server. We also talked about MongoDB. So this database server could be a MongoDB service running. It could be a Microsoft SQL Server service running. It could be just a file system that you're pumping data into. It's entirely, the world is your oyster. Basically, this thing is just some persistent strategy that you've implemented, and the EC's job is to take the data from the web API controller and shove the data into persistence somewhere. So the whole flow is the client makes a request. That's an HTTP request, a GET or a POST request on a specific route. That route is then listened to by the web API controller. It takes that request, it parses the parameters either from the body or from the route, depending on if you have a POST or a GET request respectively. It then passes those parameters to the EC, and then the EC passes that information to the database server. So many times these requests are just CRUD operations, right? So we could be creating a new item, we could be reading an item, we could be updating an item, we could be deleting an item. Then once that action is taken in the persistent store, the database is updated, the database will send back a response that says, hey, this is a 200 HTTP response, everything's cool, no need to worry. If you have worked through assignment number 4 and assignment number 5, and you've done something like forget to start the MongoDB service, or if you have used the wrong database connection string for your entity framework implementation, or for your base EC and the SQL client implementation, you will know that sometimes you don't get 200 responses back. You will get a 500 response, and the exception thrown on the server will be sent back to you, and it'll be something like a timeout. It'll be something like communication can't be established with the server, an aggregate exception, something will happen, and then it is also the client side's responsibility to then process that error and then show the error to the user in some sort of reasonable way that they can maybe do troubleshooting themselves. So if you are comfortable with the concepts of MVVM, the concepts of MVC, and that data flow that I just went through, you are sitting pretty good at a very high B kind of situation. So that's a very large portion of what you can expect to see on the final. Other things you can expect to see on the final include things like, why might we want to use what's called a DTO? Why might we want to use a view model rather than a model? So these arrows are supposed to indicate that there is potentially latency between each of these things. So let's say that you are in Papua New Guinea on a laptop, you're trying to communicate with a server in China, and then that server in China is trying to access a database server in Hawaii. In that case, what's going to happen is you're going to have a large amount of latency between each of these machines, and the more data that you pass across the wire, the more time is going to take for you to actually get a response. So what you want to do is you want to minimize the amount of data that you're passing around, and that is one of the huge benefits of using what's called a DTO, or a data transfer object. So data transfer objects are really around to only transmit the data that you actually need in order for the client-side code to do its job. In a lot of ways, view models do exactly the same thing. You don't have to send data that is only used for persistence purposes to the client. So the example that we use in the class is the last modified stamp. You don't necessarily care when the view model was last modified. You do often care the last time that the model was last modified. So that is something that you should definitely take into consideration. Other things that could be on the final include things like, let me get back over here. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, things like, how did I set up the entity framework? Did I have to have a connection string with an explicit password in it? No, you did not. The reason you didn't have to is because you had a trusted connection, and that trusted connection knew who you were because you were already logged into Windows, or you were already logged into your Mac, and you could essentially take that credential from your login, and we could pass that to the database and automatically authenticate you. If you cannot do that, you obviously don't want to pass a raw text string that has a password in it to Entity Framework. You want to encrypt that in some way. So most of the questions that will come up around that will be very obvious, and you would probably answer them correctly without actually even taking the class, because it's very, very kind of common sense sort of stuff. So module number 8 is not on the test at all. This is just for your own personal edification type stuff. And so if you look down through all of these things, really the test is around stuff that came up in the first quiz, some advanced syntax stuff. If you look at only one video, I would look at this one, because there are some coding questions. The only coding questions you can expect are explicitly from this question marks in C# video. There are also some questions about MVVM and MVC. You could get that information from looking at me actually work with them in Module 3, or you could watch the video about the theory in Module 4, where we kind of go back and explain why we did the things that we did in Module 3. I would very much take a lot of time if you're not really sure about why assignment number 4 or assignment number 5 worked the way that they worked, and you just kind of got through it by the skin of your teeth. I would definitely spend some time looking at this page. I would also look at the video and the PowerPoint presentation, recognizing that the final, again, is open notes, so you can always come back and refer to the PowerPoint presentation. It is going to be much less nerve-wracking for you if you remember a lot of the answers to the questions instead of having to like sort of frantically flip through PowerPoint presentations. So most of the information will be in these two PowerPoint presentations. Watching the videos is definitely not going to hurt you to prepare for the exam. So that is really kind of it. You will not be required to build link expressions. You will not be required to interpret link expressions. Really, the test is at a very high level. So it kind of expects that you understand how assignment number 4 and assignment number 5 hang together, and that's really the extent of it. And also, to be clear, module number 10 is also not on the final. So you will not get questions about code generation. So if you did programming assignment number 3 and you skipped out on assignment number 6, you really had no motivation to do this stuff, and I don't want to unfairly penalize you. But you should look at these things after the class is over, because this stuff, again, is definitely going to start showing up in a lot of different companies. So I think that that's basically it. I don't want to belabor the point or make the video longer than it needs to be. But if you have questions or comments or concerns about any of the stuff that I've listed as being on the final, please send me an email. I'm trying to answer them as quickly as possible, and as soon as I post this video, I will go back to answering those questions. So thank you very much, and good luck on everything. Thanks.